Thank you very much. So I've been studying schools in Chicago for the last 15 years, and I feel like every single study we do, relationships and trust come up. In fact, one of the first studies I worked on was looking at hundreds of factors about schools and trying to figure out the difference between those schools that showed remarkable improvements and those that didn't. And there were these measures of relational trust that we couldn't even keep in our models because they just swamped everything else, right, if we kept them in. Because the schools that improved were just so much more likely to have strong trust between teachers and students, teachers and teachers, teachers and principals, teachers and parents. My more recent work has really been looking at students' educational attainment and what matters for getting students to graduate from high school and then to succeed in college. And I just want to talk about this really quickly for a minute because I feel like it really colors my thinking about policy implications. We've seen huge improvements in high school graduation rates in Chicago, and that's come in large part because of the differences in the ways that people are working together, teachers with students, teachers with teachers, school leadership teams with school leadership teams. One thing we found was that the 9th grade year was a really pivotal year for both high school graduation and college readiness. Schools have responded to that by using early warning indicator data to really reach out, find out why students are why they're struggling in the 9th grade year. And that reaching out and establishing relationships, keeping students from falling through the cracks, that's made a huge difference. We found that the reason so many students fall off track for graduation in the 9th grade year is because they were moving into environments where teachers weren't monitoring them, where teachers just were leaving them on their own, where they didn't have those strong relationships with teachers. But you can't just rely on having there are always going to be those superstar teachers. You can't rely on those one or two teachers. And so when schools actually started getting data and then working together, teachers working together around the data, that's when we start to see these big improvements in 9th grade performance and then subsequent improvements in high school graduation rates. And then when we look at the schools that showed the biggest improvements in high school graduation rates, a lot of those schools belong to something called the Network for College Success, where school leadership teams, the principal, maybe the AP lead teachers, freshman team, college readiness team would get together regularly, look at each other's data, each other's school data, and share information about what they were doing to improve 9th grade performance, high school graduation, and learn from each other. And what we see is the story of improvements in high school graduation rates seems to be the story of spreading, where we have schools that are, making big improvements, and then maybe an AP from one school becomes a principal at another school, or they share practices across schools, and then this kind of learning from each other. Maybe someone becomes a network chief, and then they get schools talking to each other and learning from each other. And I think there's a lot in that story, and we've seen this huge improvement. I mean, students have gone from being as likely to drop out as they were to graduate to being 3 times more likely to graduate than they are to drop out. So remarkable improvements in 15 years, 10 or 15 years. And again, I think it's because it wasn't this top-down silver bullet, but it really was giving schools the information they need, the time, and and also the priorities to do that, right? So saying this is something that's really important to the district, and then giving them the space to let that happen. And I think because it wasn't this big, flashy program, that schools actually did have more space and time to be able to figure out how to make this work. So that's my lens as I'm talking here. And when we think about, well, what kind of policies and resources do we need to facilitate trust and collaboration among adults in the school community, I think we, at the same time, also need to be thinking about what kind of policies undermine that collaboration. Because I think if you are trying to encourage collaboration at the same time that you're doing other things that really undermine it, you could be doubly ineffective because people are just going to get frustrated and they're really not going to work together at all. If we think about what policies undermine collaboration, one thing that really comes to mind for me is policy churn. Always the new, fancy, the new thing that's going to solve it all, right? And you see this all, there's always a new initiative, right? And there's nothing more frustrating. Oh, I only have 5 minutes, okay. Right, than working together on something and then it's gone the next year, right? And on top of that, and also having lots and lots of new initiatives, because you just don't have the bandwidth to work on anything. And even when they come with new resources I think can make things worse if it's just another thing piled on top. Because what happens is you have the new resources, okay, now we're going to say, we're going to bring in someone to work on school discipline. And here, we're going to bring in someone to work on college advising. And you can actually end up outsourcing a lot of the core functions of the school rather than having resources for support staff to come and work with teachers, right, and increase the collaboration, right? And so thinking about how do you bring in resources in a way that are going to get people working together around the core mission of the school. Bo talked about accountability. I'm sure other people will talk about that. We've seen a lot of, I'll say, silver bullet policies in Chicago, so curricular reform, school turnaround, promotion standards, all these things. Everyone said, this is going to work. This time it's going to work. But a lot of these have actually led to lower achievement because they really didn't pay attention to how people in the school work together. Molly spoke earlier. She's actually doing a study right now of school closings in Chicago. If we look at Race to the Top, there is a lot of incentive there to turn around poorly performing schools. But there wasn't a lot of emphasis on how you do that, right? Lots of different options. You might turn around a school in a way that builds collaboration, or you might do it in a way that really destroys the relationships that exist. And one thing Molly's been finding is it was a very painful process in Chicago, and largely that pain came from breaking those relationships. You had teachers who had been working together. You had families that had built up trusting relationships with school staff, and now those were broken. And so that meant people had to start all over again. So when we think about what do you need, don't put that sign up. A lot of people have mentioned time, and of course time is really essential for people to work together, and that's going to be influenced by, of course, money in terms of how many resources for the time in the day, but also things like district priorities. So if you have professional development days, are you going to be mandated to do specific things, or is there going to be time there for collaboration, or are you going to mandate collaboration? I mean, you think about what are you using that for, and of course things like teacher contracts and what are the priorities there. A lot of times they're in. You want to maximize instructional time if you have to cut budgets, and so you might take out that time for teacher collaboration, but then that instructional time, of course, is not going to be as effective. So you don't just need time, but you need structures, because it's not just people getting together, right? But you need structures and resources for collaboration, so that you have, I think a lot of the people here talked about within schools, the principal being the facilitator, making sure people were staying on task, making sure there was communication among different teacher teams. You need to have structures to keep people focused on goals and make sure there's communication among all the people in the school. And I think a lot of times it's useful to have an external partner. The Network for College Success that I talked about, I think is really helpful because it not only gives school teams time to work together, but they really structure those sessions to focus on common goals and keep people focused on data. And that's another thing that I think is really important, and that's actually data. I think collaboration is strongly facilitated with data. Data on student outcomes or whatever your school goals are. So, because if you want to have difficult conversations, a lot of times they will end up with a lot of finger pointing, right? It's really hard to broach a lot of the topics, a lot of blaming of parents, blaming the teachers, blaming the students, it's your fault. But if you have data, you can keep the conversations focused on, here's where we are, this is where we need to go, right? And then you can actually be monitoring whether or not things are working rather than just kind of guessing about how things are working, and you can actually see, that you're reaching your goals. And I think that really facilitates collaboration. But of course, that means you need investments in data systems, good data systems that are actually usable. You need people who are going to respond to requests for IT changes in the data systems. People are going to help people get the information they need to work on the problems that they're working on. You need audits to make sure that the data is high quality so that people trust the data. We also should be thinking about systems for facilitating communication and collaboration between teachers and parents and families, right? Because parents can be great partners, but a lot of times there's not that communication there, or there's very kind of shallow communication, but yet you want to be able to make sure that people are working together on their goals around their children. And I mean, even, again, data and information systems that allow for that easy communication so that parents always know where students stand, but also systems for really thinking about how you bring parents and teachers in, not just in superficial ways, but really in ways that are around their shared goals for their students. And then, we also need to think about how we have those supports and the training for school leaders and for district leaders. Susan mentioned that a little bit, like what is the training that our school leaders are getting? What is the training that our superintendents are getting? What is the training that our district leaders are getting to be able to bring teams together and collaborate? We have all these state universities, we have licensure and certification programs. Is there anything in those programs that speak to training people to be able to build these relationships and get people collaborating? As we think about policy, if we are always thinking about, I think we need to really think about, is this a policy that allows people the space and the time to work together to make it work right? Any kind of policy is always going to have unintended consequences. It's never going to go exactly as people want. So thinking about, is this policy designed in a way that's going to allow people to figure out how to make it work in their context, give them the time, give them the space, and give them the support to do that.